bringing you a special edition on a peace rally taking place in Barcelona this Saturday. It's been dubbed No Tengo Miedo, Not Afraid. Now, as you're about to see here, this is the planned route of the march, which is heading towards Plaça de Catalunya. Now, tens of thousands are gathering here to condemn last week's vehicle and knife attacks that left behind a trail of bodies, including 15 dead. The events marked the deadliest onslaught on Spain in over a decade. On Friday, the Spanish Prime Minister called on everyone to participate in the march. Mariano Rajoy said, "There with all of Catalan society and all of Spain, we will once again give a clear message of unity and condemnation of terrorism." Rajoy is attending today's rally alongside King Felipe VI, Barcelona Mayor Ada Colau and Catalonia's President Carles Puigdemont. Now, over the next hour, we'll be crossing to Guillaume Denoy de Saint-Marc from the French capital, and he's from the French Association of Victims of Terrorism. And in the studio, we're joined by Dennis Wecker, researcher in terrorism and radicalization. Dennis, thank you for joining us. And of course, our own international affairs editor, Armin Georgian. Thank you, Armin. But first, let's go to our correspondent on the ground, Sarah Morris, who's following the day's events for us from Barcelona. Sarah, where are we at with the rally? I'm hearing there's a lot of tight security where you are.
That's certainly true. There's snipers on all the rooftops here. The police are looking into the drains to check that there's no explosives and no threat to this march because it's due to kick off at 6 o'clock any moment now. The people are rallied at the Paseo de Gracia. That march, that walk would normally take about half an hour, but with tens and thousands of people already lining all the streets, it could take a little while longer. The 75 most important people are at the front of the procession, and they involve many of the people that rushed out onto the Ramblas on Thursday night when that van with a man drove down and started ploughing into people. And they are, of course, the emergency services, but also the florists who had stalls on the Ramblas, and many people who simply stores from their flats came down with bottles of water, taxi drivers that took people to the 8 hospitals in the area, and of course the emergency services that spent hours trying to save people's lives. They are at the front of the procession. In fact, we've seen the head of the government, Carles Puigdemont, the mayor, Ada Colau, and the government's representative here in Barcelona, all speaking to those people, thanking them for their efforts and saying that the scars of that night won't go away, but nor will the gratefulness of the people for what they did.
Sarah Morris, our correspondent in Barcelona, we will be going back to you throughout the show. Now, Armin, here in the studio, I want you to talk us through the symbolic significance of an event like this. Of course, we had something very similar back in Paris after the Charlie Hebdo attacks.
Yeah, we're seeing some of the same slogans that have been used in other European cities that have been hit by ISIS, particularly, I don't know, we saw it a few moments ago, No Tinc Por, which is Catalan for I'm not afraid. We're seeing, of course, a lot of Catalan symbols and flags as well in that rally already in these live pictures. I'm not afraid, exactly the same slogan that was going around in London after the attacks in Westminster Bridge, after the attacks in Manchester as well. So we've seen a lot of solidarity between European cities with, for example, the Eiffel Tower showing flags of the other countries affected and that kind of mutual recognition, solidarity. But one thing we need to bear in mind, I think, if we want to put terrorism in perspective, is that most terrorist attacks in the world have actually been happening outside Europe. And if you take a study from the University of Maryland, which looked at all terrorist attacks in 2016, only 2% of attacks happened in Europe. The others were in the Middle East and Africa and Southeast Asia and so on. So I think it's important to keep that in perspective because, of course, in the Western media, naturally, we focus on this kind of geographical and cultural proximity. So we give a lot of importance to these events, perhaps less so to events in Tehran or Jakarta or other places.
You say that, Armin, but Dennis Wecker, of course, with the Islamic State group losing ground in countries like Iraq and Syria, it seems like, and that's according to a lot of analysts, the shift of the attack is actually moving to abroad, essentially. That's why we're seeing increasingly more and more onslaughts on European nations.
That is exactly right. The Islamic State has announced this last year already that they called openly for their fighters not to join them in Syria and Iraq anymore, as you rightly said, because of the ground they're losing. And they are encouraging them to conduct more attacks in the European countries. So this doesn't come as a surprise, yes. And to go back on your point also, as you rightly said, only 2% of those attacks worldwide happen in Europe, and in comparison to that, it's only, if I read the report correctly, 0.7% of all the casualties, so that gives you a perspective on what we're talking about. But what needs to be said is that we as Europeans are simply not used to this kind of violence. If you speak to some people in the Middle East where attacks happen on a daily basis, they get used to it, unfortunately, right? But every time we see someone getting killed here in our streets, it's very much closer to us. It's the proximity that gives us more empathy, maybe.
Now, we have a gathering here, as you can see in all these images of potentially tens of thousands with authorities and representatives from both Spain and Catalonia. Yet an event like this, Dennis, could definitely be an obvious target for terrorist cells. How much of a challenge is this for Spanish authorities and, of course, the organizers of the event?
It's not too much of a challenge, to be honest. You see the same things happening at other events, whether this is in Paris or in London. The police and law enforcement simply look at the street maps and close off the streets with barricades, with bullets, with soldiers and police officers, so that no car can potentially go through. But of course, you can never eradicate a threat completely, right?
Now, going back to Armin, I want to discuss a little bit about the political implications of the attacks that we've seen in Spain. An event like this has certainly highlighted the gaps that exist within the country, certainly between the Catalan regional and Spanish national governments. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. I don't know if we can, well, I suppose it's not up to us when we get the image exactly, but it was interesting. Just a few moments ago, we saw some major political figures in Spain in that, I don't know if it was the front rank of the march or not.
It was the front rank, yeah.
It was, right. So we had King Felipe, of course. We had Mariano Rajoy, the Spanish Prime Minister, and also Carles Puigdemont, who is the president of the Catalan regional government. And this is now a moment to try and bring these people together. And I think it's highly symbolic that they were all in that same rank, just one or two sort of members away from each other, because there's been a lot of tensions over the last couple of weeks, with a lot of mutual recriminations between Madrid and the Catalan regional government about supposedly the Spanish security service being excluded at certain points of the investigation, of the investigation being politicized. And really, it's remarkable how quickly the sort of ghosts of 2004 returned. You remember when Spanish conservatives were accused of politicizing the attacks at Atocha, at the train station, and that they blamed ETA instead of Al-Qaeda. And some pro-independence Catalan publications have said now there's a similar kind of manipulation going on. The Spanish conservatives want to stop this referendum happening on October the 1st. So
that's a big question. How does an event like this affect the upcoming referendum for Catalonia's potential independence?
Well, for now, I think obviously today is a moment to kind of raise, to lower the political temperature a bit, and to try and come back to that sense of unity which existed just after the attacks. It was fairly short-lived. It didn't actually survive the end of the hunt for the assailants, but at least in the first couple of days, you did have that unity. Today, obviously, is a moment to try to bring that back. But in terms of the referendum, I mean, I think we'll talk more about that during the special program. But in essence, I mean, the opinion polls, I think, I saw in a Catalan paper that they hadn't really moved, the figures hadn't really moved. In other words, before the terrorist attacks, there was a slight majority of Catalans in favor of staying within Spain, but with greater autonomy. And as we saw with the attacks in London and Manchester, there wasn't really a major impact on the outcome of the British election. Of course, it slightly changed the dynamics in the short term, but overall, the fundamental issues of political, of sovereignty or autonomy, and the sort of relationship between Madrid and Barcelona, that's pretty much a constant, regardless of what happened on Las Ramblas.
Now, Arman's been obviously talking about the tensions that exist within the country, and I want to discuss with you, Dennis Wecker, what goes beyond Spain's borders. Certainly, geographically speaking, it's along the Mediterranean coastline. It's just across from Morocco, which makes it, in my opinion, and certainly according to analysts, all the more an inviting entry point for jihadists. Yet, it's managed to avoid attacks like this for some 13 years.
It has managed to avoid attacks. What it has not managed is the buildup of jihadi cells in and around Barcelona. We have seen this since 2012 on already, and this was followed by many arrests over the last 2 years. The Spanish intelligence service has done a great job in foiling a few attacks. And as I said, there is a hub building in Barcelona and some of its suburbs, and whether there is a socio-economic pattern that can be identified or put into comparison with Paris and some of its neighborhoods, or Brussels and some of its neighborhoods, that's the big question. But as you rightly said, Spain is also used as a transfer route from Morocco, from Algeria, from Tunisia, into more central parts of Europe.
I think we'll cross back now to our correspondent on the ground, Sarah Morris, who's been certainly monitoring the events for us. Sarah, you're at the march. Would you say that people have flocked to this rally from not only across the country but further afield? I think the one thing that we're noticing here is that unlike the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we saw leaders from the international community flock to Paris. Why is that not the case in Barcelona?
It may very well be the case that these attacks are becoming sadly all too common, and so although other cities and countries in Europe are offering their support, the shock of the initial attacks on Charlie Hebdo and afterwards in Paris, perhaps now there's a certain sense of resignation, and people even expected Spain to be next at some point. We've certainly seen some mayors reaching out, saying cities in peace, and that has happened from the mayor of Paris, London, New York. There's certainly an international support, and lots of messages of support have arrived. But this has turned out to be a very Spanish and Catalan procession today. What we certainly have seen is people making an effort to come over to Barcelona, despite the regional differences. There's a lot of tensions in Spain, but the government, for instance, has got its whole cabinet here, bar one, and the regional leaders from across Spain have all sent somebody to represent them. We've seen unionists, we've seen business leaders, all headed from the four corners of Spain to the capital. And the Catalan authorities have done a lot to lay on extra trains, about 50 local commuter trains to bring people in, 40% more metros. We've seen that the Catalans are already pretty used to big demonstrations because they have a pro-independence movement that is pretty strong, but a lot of those people have come out today for different reasons, and we've seen people who perhaps don't come onto the streets of Barcelona coming out. We've seen all sorts of banners, peace, it seems to be one of the main slogans, and not afraid. We see that in different languages. One of the other things that we're seeing is flags. This is a chance for the pro-independence movement to bring out that famous Catalan flag with a star on it, which is a pro-independence flag. We've also seen people who are handing out roses in the Catalan colours of yellow, red, white, and those flowers have been offered for free by the florists, many of whom were on the Ramblas on the day when the van drove through it.
Now, Sarah, earlier we were speaking to our International Affairs editor, Armin Georgian, who was discussing the tough talk that's exchanged between the Catalan regional and Spanish national governments. It feels like certainly at this rally, there is no sense of disunity. Am I incorrect in saying that?
I think you're broadly correct in saying that, because I think a huge effort has been made, and the Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy has tried to put aside some of the debates that we've seen in the Spanish press there were a lot of blamed accusations between why was this terror cell not detected earlier in Catalonia? Was it the fault of the Spanish police, the national police, for not sharing information? Was it the local Mossos, the Catalan police, because there was a message sent from Brussels that might have been mislaid, ignored? And Mariano Rajoy tried to say thank you to all of the police forces for that operation, which located the terror cell shortly after the attacks and killed 6 of them, arrested 4, and found out that 2 of them had already died in that house where they were keeping explosives. So Mariano Rajoy has tried to breach divisions by saying everybody deserves thanks, but nevertheless they are out there on the streets today. Some people threatened not to go to this demonstration. They were a minority, I would say, but the minority party CUP, that is propping up the Catalan government, they threatened to not attend because of the presence of Felipe VI. They are Republican people, and they think that the royal family doesn't do enough and that the sort of policies of the royal family with connections with royals in Saudi Arabia, they don't think that helps to fight international terrorism.
Sarah Morris reporting for us from Barcelona. We will be coming back to you. Armin, I want to go back to that topic that Sarah was just talking about, the fact that you've had a large number of people, certainly from the far left, saying we're not coming to this rally because of the relationship that exists between Spain and the Saudi monarchy, who they feel could be accountable for certainly the attacks that are taking place, not just across the continent, but across the world.
Yeah, actually, I was just noticing there were a few sort of discordant, if you will, messages in the crowd there. I mean, some of them are kind of very consensual, we want peace and so on, and the best response is peace, no to Islamophobia. We saw, of course, a lot of those sort of placards in Paris as well. But there are quite a few discordant ones too. There's one I've seen, a very big banner which says, "Your policies, our dead," which sounds like a dig against the Spanish central government, although I'm not exactly sure the background to that. And also there's another one that says, "Mariano wants peace, don't sell weapons." So I don't know again if that's a far left group or is this the CUP, the anti-monarchist party, but there are references in the crowd to Saudi Arabia. There are references to the King of Spain and his supposed links with Saudi Arabia. So clearly not everyone is. You can tell there are tensions in this rally. It's not just okay peace. There's something more edgy going on there, clearly.
So Armin's covering that angle for us. Dennis, I want to talk to you about the actual terror attack and the dismantling of the cell. What can you tell us about that? Certainly it seems, as far as I know, the latest information that we have, that none of the terrorists were on any lists.
They were under the radar, and what is very interesting in this particular case is the timeline. Apparently, the attackers and their supporter were preparing the attack for almost over a year. Now, what needs to be said about the specific people involved here is we are talking about 4 pairs of brothers and a few cousins and a few other relatives, if I'm informed correctly. They knew each other from childhood. That means they are having a very strong linkage from very early on, which is very important if you exchange information about a potential attack, because you need to trust each other. Now, having said this, there was another person involved, the recruiter, the Imam Es-Saadi, and he seemed to be the person who put oil into the fire. And all these people were under the radar based on a few facts, because they trusted each other, they knew each other from childhood on, as I said, and they were operating outside of Barcelona in a few different suburbs in a house that they rented, where they had those 120 gas bottles that went off a little too early. And most people agree that the reason we have seen the attack was purely because those explosions happened earlier at the house and they were afraid of getting caught. I think we can all be very lucky that we have only seen so little casualties, if you ask me. It could have been much worse if they would have proceeded with their initial plan, which included 3 vehicles.
Yeah, just to pick up on the the relatives and the cousins. I mean, that's sort of a pattern you see with the Kouachi brothers or the people who did the Paris attacks as well in November 2015, isn't it? That's something that sort of comes back a lot. It's the family keeping things in the family in order to stay under the radar.
That's exactly right, and it's this peer-to-peer network that a lot of researchers also talk about. So there were a few people who called this the lone wolf pack, right? Because in the past we were sometimes talking about a lone wolf who is going out on his own or her own and conducting something bad, but the pattern that we put on a lot of the attacks over the last 2 years don't seem to hold, because we see different patterns and we see people who are completely under the radar, who are very well connected, and this imam that we were talking about seemed to have a very broad network across Europe. Maybe we can talk about that a little later. But all the attackers that we've seen in Paris, in Brussels, in Barcelona now, they seem to be belonging to the same network, or at least the recruiters of these cells.
But at no point have we had any indication that, because obviously we're hearing the name of the Islamic State group being thrown about, we know that they've praised the attack and actually called the perpetrators soldiers of the Islamic State. But is there direct involvement? How much logistical, financial support are these, as you called them, lone wolf pack attackers receiving?
We never know. Most of the cases are just influenced by the Islamic State, and there's no direct control by an emir from the Islamic State. The online propaganda certainly doesn't help at all. And there is a few things that the intelligence services need to do here. They, first of all, need to stock up their staff. The intelligence sharing needs to be improved, not just across Europe, but also internationally. I have seen different accounts where there might have been some intelligence from the US and that got passed on a little too late. Of course, I can't verify that. I only heard that from other accounts. But these are the points that need to be addressed when we talk about the intelligence services here.
Now, obviously, Dennis has just picked up on the problems, the issues that have occurred as a result of intelligence errors. The criticism is coming not just from within Spain, but across the continent. I'll give you a little example here. It appears that Belgium gave police in Catalonia a tip-off back in 2016 about one of the suspects. Seems like the critics do have a point.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, there was a controversy about whether that information was shared with the Spanish government or not, but I believe that in Catalonia, the police do, on issues of international terrorism, they do have to go through Madrid. So perhaps there was actually more cooperation that the two sides care to admit publicly for understandable political reasons right now.
Now, Armin, staying on that topic, we know that Mariano Rajoy, the Spanish Prime Minister, has called for a summit next week with the presence of French, German and Italian leaders. They want more cooperation to fight terror. Is there any idea what we can expect to see on the agenda? And that question also goes to you, Dennis, afterwards.
Well, I think one thing they'll look at, obviously, is the cross-border visits, because we know that one of the attackers was flashed his car. The same Audi was flashed in the Essonne area just outside of Paris before the attacks on Las Ramblas. But again, I suppose that the key thing, as always, is personnel. How many people can you really dedicate to to keeping someone under surveillance. And for how long do you do that? If they haven't done anything wrong for a while, you're going to obviously divert the resources somewhere else. Should that person, but as we heard from Dennis anyway, they were not even, most of them were not even being followed by the security forces, were they? So what would be the reason to even begin to the surveillance anyway? In the first place?
That's exactly right. And you can't arrest anyone based on the fact that they're meeting up, can you? You need more facts. And I know this from intelligence sources. As soon as the CIA, for example, has something, they can do something about it. But it seems that in this case that there was too little information.
That just seems like essentially a poor excuse. There's too little information, and it seems like increasingly the attackers are on the radars of, even if there's not enough evidence, they're on the radars. They're being flagged up to an extent. So why are we not essentially in Europe investing in more money in monitoring these people that are coming up? Certainly in France, we've had a number of fichiers who have turned out to be terrorists.
That's exactly right, and that's a good point. And that's what I mentioned earlier, right? You need to upgrade your intelligence services, and you need to have more staff. And when we talk about the people that we've seen in Barcelona, they were a little different. We always talking about when we talk about the Paris or Brussels attacker, they were not included into society. They didn't have opportunities, etc. These people were integrated. They went to school. They had jobs. That's why they were also under the radar. They were not engaging in radical speech so much. They were not in the open on the online media, for example. That certainly doesn't help the intelligence services to detect them. And of course, we're all humans in the end of the day. And of course, we also make mistakes. I'm not the CIA myself or DGSE or whoever, so I can't speak for them what's been going wrong. Or if there was something that...
So you can't speak for them in terms of what's going wrong, but I think what this is a question that's on our lips now since the Nice attacks. How can we prevent these attacks that are taking place with vehicles? So not necessarily explosions, not necessarily weapons. Everyday vehicles are being used as part of an onslaught against innocent people. Is there any way we can prevent that?
Why have they been used? Because it's so easy to acquire them, because it's so easy to conduct the attack. Some countries are calling for more regulations from the rental companies, for example, that they should conduct more background checks. But, in the end of the day, also, this guy just stole the passport of his brother. So what do you want to do in the end of the day? You can't do much. You can never completely eradicate the threat, unfortunately. As sad as that to say.
You can do background checks on somebody who's going to hire a car, but if that doesn't link up with some other information that says that this person is suspect, then it's not going to lead to anything. A good example would be, I forget his name now, the man who was the Nice attacker, right? It turned out that he had been going on jihadist websites, although he wasn't known to be in any particular network, but he was one of these people who sort of, if you want to use the word lone wolf, anyway, he seemed to fit that profile when the first analysis came out. And, but it comes back to human resources again. They didn't have the people, or didn't want to invest in a massive expansion of surveillance that would have, people every time somebody goes on a jihadist forum of some kind, that there's somebody tracking that activity, and then you have to start tracking what that person is doing, their movements in Nice from point A to B to C. I mean, this would be a massive expansion of resources, wouldn't it, Dennis?
Absolutely right. And just to give you an example, I myself, in my function as a researcher, obviously I hang out in a lot of these Telegram channels where those guys try to communicate their stuff. And just to give you some figures, in some channels you have 30,000 people. And there is hundreds and thousands of messages each day. And this is just public channels. So you can imagine how many private conversations there are. And I mean, intelligence services do have means of intercepting these communications. So Telegram is not completely secure and encrypted, right? But as you rightly say, you can't look into every single case. And once you have identified radical speech on the internet, for example, you we need to conduct further research. Where is this person? What is his actual identity? A lot of these people also use technology to, you know, appear somewhere else on the map. You know, it's not that easy.
Now, I want to go back to the rally that the images of which we're looking at right now. You have Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy, King Felipe, standing side by side next to a young veiled Muslim woman holding a flower. And that's a clear message, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is a clear message. Of course, it's a message, backing up the banners of no to Islamophobia that we've seen further behind. But it's also interesting if you look at the person. So there's another woman to the right. Oh, we just lost that picture. She was standing to the left of King Felipe, and next to her is the president of the Catalan region. He's being kept quite far apart from the Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy. So you've got the symbolic divide of the king as this kind of neutral figure that supposedly all Spaniards look up to, and then you've got the Catalan regional leader who's been at loggerheads with the Spanish Prime Minister. They're being kept well apart, and I think that perhaps clues you into some of the tensions that have been going on in the wake of these attacks, but of course that have been really festering. In fact, until these terrorist attacks happened, there we have Carlos Puigdemont, so two people to the left to King Felipe's left, and then you've got Mariano Rajoy there to the right of King Felipe, so on the left of our picture, standing next to the veiled woman. Those two leaders, Puigdemont and Rajoy, had not even met since April 2016. April 2016. So it was. There's Felipe Gonzalez, the former Prime Minister, of course, who was elected just after the 2004 terrorist attacks in Madrid. But Puigdemont and Rajoy had not met for 16 months then, until these terrorist attacks happened. They held a joint press conference, but very quickly the sniping started again between the political authorities in Barcelona and in Madrid.
I want to go back to our correspondent, Sarah Morris, who is on the ground in Barcelona for us following the latest developments. Now, Sarah, I understand that later on we will have a brief manifesto that will be read out. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that will be some readings carefully chosen, and they'll be read by a Spanish actress and a representative from an organisation that's worked very hard for integration, particularly of Moroccan immigrants in Catalonia. And they've been chosen to read some readings, and there'll also be some music played which represents peace. It will be carefully choreographed. We're expecting it to be very short. Just behind me, you've seen in your images the arrival of the King and the Prime Minister. Very interesting, because the King is quite a tall man, and so I saw him first before I saw the other people. He was really in the crowd that enters this square and walking as a normal member of the protest, really. But on the way, he was booed considerably as he walked through the streets, as was the Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy. Quite a tense atmosphere. But when they arrived, the first people to be brought into this square were the emergency services and the firefighters, and then all the politicians came in with the King.
So you've been talking about the authorities that are attending the rally. I want to hear a little bit more about what people have been saying to those that are attending the rally, whether they're Spaniards, whether they're from Catalonia. What are you hearing from them? Why have they decided to attend this march?
They really feel it's time to take the streets back, as they put it to me. They said some of them really feel that the logo of this demonstration, "Not Afraid," in a way doesn't quite reflect their mood, because they are afraid. They have really gone through a very difficult 10 days, not just the attacks in Barcelona, the attacks in Cambrils. They've also seen on Twitter, they have seen people who grew up in Spain broadcasting messages for Daesh in Spanish, saying that there'll be more such attacks. They said they are afraid, but they do feel they have to come out and protest against this kind of attack, because these were people who were going about their normal business. These were people who were enjoying the public promenades in Cambrils as well, that other coastal town which was also hit, and they felt that they had to come here today. Many of them came from some distance away, some of them live in Barcelona, some of them sit out on the Ramblas every day on the benches beside it, and they really felt that they had to be here. Now, some people were disappointed that the king was booed at. They felt that it degenerated in some parts of the crowd a little bit, they said, like a King's Cup, because of course in the King's Cup finals often we see Real Madrid against Barcelona, and there's a lot of opportunities to play politics really, and some people said they found that a little bit disappointing.
Now, Sarah, I understand that earlier in the day you were in Las Ramblas, where the attack took place last week. Obviously, that's not the heart of the rally itself, but it's become a quasi-shrine to the victims.
It certainly has. There's lots of shrines, in fact, because where the van and the man drove into lots of people, there have been mini shrines erected with lots of names written on the trees. There have been candles lit on the streets. People have brought teddy bears to remind people that children died in the attack, a 7-year-old boy and a 3-year-old boy. And that's very moving for people. The tourists and people coming down the Ramblas stop and look at all those children's toys and the candles and the messages which are written in all different languages to reflect the fact that we're more than 30 nationalities among the victims, and it took many of those people who flew over to Barcelona to find out what had happened to their loved ones. It took them days really to find out news and to work out whether their family members would survive those tragic injuries.
Now, Sarah, I have one last question for you. Earlier, the International's Affairs editor Armin Georgian and myself were discussing the fact that we're seeing representatives from the Muslim community at the front of the line along Spanish and the Catalan authorities. It's very clear what kind of a message this is sending, but beyond that, what is Spain doing to prevent the disintegration of the Muslim community? Something that we've witnessed in the UK, certainly an upsurge of racism in France. How are they taking steps and measures to prevent that from happening?
Well, there's a feeling that more should be done. 200 Muslim associations immediately held a rally after those attacks in Barcelona with signs saying "Not in our name," and they're working very closely with the Spanish authorities. They're talking about there are mosques where there's not many controls of imams, but in most of the mosques there are, and they are trying to send out the message that really this is a minority that has managed to radicalize young people like this, and they must play a bigger role. They are looking to places like France and Belgium, where more control has taken place with moderate imams and proper training, and they would like to follow some of those guidelines. The Prime Minister has appealed for Europe to start to do more and to exchange information in a better way, and to look at what more could be done because this is a Europe-wide problem after all.
Sarah Morris reporting for us from Barcelona. We'll be going back to her throughout the show for further updates. Now, Dennis Wecker, researcher in terrorism and radicalization. We know that for over a decade, Spain was one of the few countries that seemed somewhat immune to the wave of terror attacks that had been rocking other European countries. What went wrong this time?
Nothing in particular went wrong. It's the same things we see all over Europe. You have suburbs with higher immigration. You have people who were not given the same opportunities in life, who don't identify with the country they're living in, even though they might hold the passport of the country. There are many sociological factors here when it comes to the radicalization.
But why now in Spain? Because we've seen this sort of repeated pattern in France, certainly.
I can't give you the answer why now. I'm surprised it didn't happen earlier, if you ask me. As I said, there is a certain hub of jihadis outside Barcelona, but it's no different than any other European country, and I wouldn't be surprised if it happens again. I'm sorry if I'm too honest here, but this is what we need to look at, and this is what we need to fight.
And also, I suppose, the speed with which it seems to happen now, which, I don't know, I've seen various research which kind of suggests that this, process of suddenly being ready to give your life is kind of shortening. I don't know if you've found that in your research.
Well, there is one interesting aspect that I'm looking into right now, and it actually affects the media. Because if you look into the psychology of a suicide attacker, into the martyrdom of an attacker, all he wants is that his family and his supporters at some point know his name, know that he was in the media. So we can maybe do a better job in putting abbreviations of a name out to the media, not the full name. Because if a suicide attacker knows in advance that nobody will ever see the real name of who committed this atrocity, the risk will be less. This is what we see from interviews with terrorists, with interviews we've conducted in prisons. This is just the pure psychology behind a suicide attack, right?
But I suppose even if that happened, ISIS would still claim
of course,
the attacks.
Of course, but the probability would maybe be a little lower if we would not give too much attention also. But at the same time, you want to inform the general public about what has happened in as much detail as possible, right? So I also understand that it's hard to find the balance here.
Now, Armin, I want to go back to what we were discussing earlier about the tensions on both sides, both the regional government of Spain and Catalonia, and the fact that you could say, certainly for the day, despite the distance that you see, physically speaking, between the authorities that are standing in front of the rally, that's a facade of unity for now, but they are threatening to somewhat boil over. Rajoy has very much threatened to block the vote of the upcoming referendum in October. And this is a question I'm going to put to both of you, actually. Does something like this make Spain more of a target?
More of a target? I'm not sure. I mean, again, I think, as we said before, the cooperation was generally, it seemed to be pretty comprehensive, where it was needed between Barcelona and Madrid, even though the police force...
You say that, but for example, we had Mariano Rajoy trying to set people's minds at ease at some point, saying that it took some 100 hours to completely dismantle the terror cell. And then you had officials from Catalonia coming out to say that wasn't the case. So even in trying to set people's minds at ease, they were contradicting each other.
It's true, yeah. There were a couple of points like that. There was one was about whether the cell had been dismantled or not, and the other controversy was about whether the Catalan police took on board what Spanish authorities were saying about the house in Alcanar, you remember, which was the bomb-making factory, effectively. So yeah, definitely there were, again, to get to the bottom of that, how much politicization was there really in those statements from both sides, I just don't know. But in terms of more of a target, I don't know. Again, I suppose it depends whether to what extent this has really laid bare or not problems of multiple coordination. But to me, I mean, Dennis would be better placed to answer this question than me. But I got the impression that it's not as dysfunctional as, the criticism that was made of Belgium with all the different layers of authority after the Brussels attacks. I don't know.
Before I go to Dennis, I just want to point out to the images that we're seeing here. I believe this is a short manifesto that is being read out at the rally by an activist from the Muslim community and a Spanish actress. We will go back to that later, and we'll return to Sarah Morris on the ground to see what information she can give us about the manifesto. And Dennis, going back to the topic of the political divisions, the gaps that exist within the country, can you tell us whether you think something like that can make a country more susceptible to attacks? Because certainly, I remember in the aftermath of the attacks on Tehran, you had the country's highest power, Ayatollah Khamenei, supreme leader, come out and call on the different factions to come together so that the country is not left with some kind of a vacuum, essentially, for terrorism.
And that's a very good example of what you can do. You should bring communities together. You should install people within these communities where a maybe radicalization process can be reported to on an anonymous level also. But of course, I can only tell you what shouldn't be done, and it's not listening to more conservative voices, not listening to more popularist voices. We should try to be more open to other cultures and other identities and nations, and by doing that, we can do a lot, if you ask me.
I'll just take a break from that. Earlier on Saturday, our correspondents in Barcelona spoke to several people who had already taken to the streets. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
We wanted to come here to the demonstration to try and take in everything that's happened. It's important to be together and to show we're all united.
We are going to participate in the march today to say we are Muslims, not terrorists.
We wanted to come and see, to pay our respects near all these flowers. It's very strange. It's strange to think that just days ago there were people walking around just like we are now, and they lost their lives.
Everybody's concerned, aren't they? I mean, we have atrocities in Manchester and London. I won't say we're used to it, we don't like it, but it won't stop me from doing what I want to do.
We're not afraid. The day after the attack, I came here because I work in Barcelona. We can't stay home. We have to go on with our lives as normal.
My wife and I walk down this street all the time. We're not going to be scared. We're not going to stop coming because of an attack.
It's very sad and unfortunate what has happened, but we've not let it stop our hen party that we're out for, and we're still enjoying it. Yeah. And I think life goes on. You have to, stay positive and carry on, really.
Thanks for watching France24. We are bringing you a special edition from the city of Barcelona, where tens of thousands of Spaniards and foreigners have taken to the streets in a march dubbed No Tengo Miedo, as you can see in these images, not afraid. The event comes following last week's deadly vehicle and knife attacks that left 15 people dead. Well, at the rally, we have the country's Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, and King Felipe VI. Now, in the studio, we are joined by Dennis Wecker, researcher in terrorism and radicalization, and, of course, our international affairs editor, Armin Georgian. Thank you both for being with us throughout the hour. I want to go back to something, Dennis, that we were discussing earlier. The Islamic State group seems to be lashing out. They are losing territory. In fact, earlier today we saw that the city of Al-Afar, which is one of the last bastions, is almost recaptured by Iraqi government forces. Is the idea to refocus their energy in terms of attacking and onslaughts and showing the world that there is still a caliphate by attacking countries abroad, especially as we've been seeing recently, Europe?
Now, most attacks that we have seen were not directly controlled by someone from within Syria. So they have been inspired attacks by people who, as I said, had a sense of non-belonging, maybe were attracted by the ideology.
Dennis, can we take a quick moment to listen to the music that's currently being played in the march in Barcelona? was the iconic El Cantes Ocels by Catalan cellist Paul Casals. Now, before that, we were speaking with Dennis Wecker, researcher in terrorism and radicalization, about the fact that the Islamic State group is somewhat losing territory within the region, hence focusing attacks abroad. And you were telling us about the ideology that exists and certainly the fact that not all these attacks are being coordinated out of Syria.
You can drop as many bombs as you want on the Middle East or Syria and Iraq in this case. You will never eradicate the ideology. This is the same that we have seen with Al-Qaeda after 2003, where the US and its allies thought they were defeated in the holes in Afghanistan. And just a few years later, you had people from Al-Qaeda who started something new. And the same thing will probably happen after you decimate ISIS. They're controlling less and less land, that is right. But they still have a lot of followers in the West, all over the world. We're also seeing a lot of activity in the Philippines right now, in Southeast Asia. So no, it will not be eradicated after that.
You mentioned Al-Qaeda, Dennis, but I suppose the difference you could say now is that although these things kind of morph into a different entity, what's different now is this homegrown, it seems to be more prominent in Europe, the homegrown jihad phenomenon, because I suppose in the past militants would train somewhere else and attack somewhere, like 9/11 would be a good example, but now that it's there's something about the ideology today which really seems to attract some young people to do these things in their home countries. Do you think that's a kind of leap from a big change from the past?
That is a big change. Also by the type of attack. If you remember, the types of attacks Al-Qaeda conducted were much more sophisticated. They were planned over years, if you think about 9/11, for example. So these attacks we are seeing recently over the last couple of years are much simpler. And one of the new phenomena that we see is that people are attracted by the ideology, yes, but if you ask them about their religious knowledge, you'll find out they know very little about the Quran, about Islam. They join a lot of the times because they want to give their life a better sense. They want to see justice, for example, in the Middle East. They don't know all the different links in the Middle East, but they see a war on television, for example, and they see, okay, there is people who need justice, and people who have my confession, and I should do something about this. And the next step or two are that people become extremists, and that is what is happening here.
Thank you, Dennis. I think it's time for us to go back to our correspondent on the ground, Sarah Morris, who is in Barcelona at that rally following the latest developments for us. Sarah, thanks again for joining us. We can see the flags are flying high, slogans are being chanted. And of course, only moments ago, we saw that a manifesto was being read out on the main stage. Can you talk us through what was said?
It started off saying we haven't got any fear, and listed a whole series of things that the people didn't fear, and among that it was condemning violence, condemning terrorism. It said that they were very proud of the rapid response of the emergency services on that terrible Thursday night, and that brought a huge applause here among the crowd. Then there was some very beautiful poetry that was read. A lot of the poetry was read in Catalan as well as Spanish. The messages were also read in the two languages that the people here speak. Federico García Lorca wrote a very famous poem about the Ramblers, and they read quite a few lines from that, where he talked about the Ramblers being this wonderful place that people go to enjoy the four seasons. Very short readings from two women who the mayor said that she chose because they are women who represent Barcelona. They love Barcelona. One of them is an actress, Rosa Rosa Maria Sarda, very well known, has won many prizes here. And the second one is Miriam Hatibi, and she is a member of a very famous organisation here that does a lot of work with integration of Moroccan immigrants in Catalonia. And those two women really represented the mood of Barcelona, which stood up to these attacks that were so devastating.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you, Sarah Morris, for joining us from Barcelona. I'd also like to thank Dennis Wecker and Armand Georgian for joining us here in the studio. Of course, Sarah Morris, who's been providing updates for us throughout the day. And thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.
Here at France 24, we're taking a broad outlook by talking about the women who are reshaping our world.
في فرانس 24 لا ننسى ونحجز لكم أسبوعياً تذكرة عودة للمدن والمناطق التي كانت في قلب الأحداث قبل أن تدخل في طي النسيان.
France 24, c'est la recherche permanente des meilleurs spécialistes pour vous permettre de déchiffrer l'actualité.
أخبار سياسية واقتصادية وثقافية وأيضاً رياضية بأعين خبراء رياضيين. هذه هي قناة فرانس 24.
I find the team here at France 24 humble, hardworking, and with their feet on the ground.
Et c'est une des seules chaînes d'infos où on nous laisse jouer en plateau avec des Legos, avec des robots, avec tout un tas d'objets.
We take a return ticket to revisit some of the key people and places of the last 50 years of world television news.
على فرانس 24 يمكننا أن نحاور أصحاب القرار من العالم في كل الميادين ولدينا المساحة لكشف ثنايا مسيرتهم.
Les femmes, elles sont souvent victimes de l'actualité internationale, mais ce sont aussi des actrices majeures de la géopolitique. Et d'ailleurs, on en parle dans France 24.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyse how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit, on France 24 and France24.com.
What do you want from your news website? France24's.com, giving you easier access to information and faster for a unique experience. France24.com, the international news website.
Not afraid, a defiant Barcelona marches against terror this Saturday, just a week after deadly attacks that tore through the city, leaving 15 dead. Al-Afar is on the verge of becoming completely recaptured. That's according to Iraqi government forces. The city is one of the Islamic State group's last bastions in the country. Also coming up, the fiercest storm to hit the US in more than a decade begins to wind down. Reports of damage and injuries from Hurricane Harvey have been trickling in since it slammed Texas on Friday. Now, welcome back. I'm Sanam Shanti, and those were the headlines on France 24. We start with the city of Barcelona, where tens of thousands of Spaniards and foreigners have taken to the streets in a march dubbed No Tengo Miedo, not afraid, as you can see in these images. The event comes following last week's deadly vehicle and knife attacks that left 15 people dead. The country's Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy and King Felipe VI also attended the rally. Now, for more on this story, let's cross to our correspondent on the ground, that's Sarah Morris. Sarah, thanks again for joining us. Can you tell us exactly what you've been seeing during this march? You've been there from the beginning, you've watched people gather, take to the streets, the authorities line up a number of speeches. What's going on?
It's been an unusual mixture, really, of the great and the good and the ordinary people, because we've seen the King Felipe VI and the Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy marching alongside ordinary people who work in the public services and the firefighters and the doctors and nurses that helped people on that night on Thursday and on Friday in the early hours of the morning after those attacks. Really got pride of place in this demonstration, and that's exactly what the Mayor Ada Colau wanted. She wanted those people to be treated as heroes, and they certainly were. The king was welcomed by many, but he was also booed along the route by some people who felt that the policies of the Spanish government, the state and the king are partly responsible for international terrorism. We've seen pictures of George Bush and pictures of José María Aznar, who was a former Spanish prime minister, and the suggestion has been that some of their foreign policies don't help to bring peace to the world. Lots and lots of symbols of peace have been out on the procession as well, and we've heard a very, very beautiful, very, very short series of poems and cello music behind me, all about symbolizing peace, and some of the poetry all about the Ramblas, that really famous symbol really of Madrid and the Mediterranean in many ways, the Ramblas, where those first attacks took place. Lots of poetry being read and a very short ceremony, and now the people behind me are being invited to make their way out of the square. Some of them are staying behind me to hear some of the music that is still being played.
Sarah, looking beyond today's event, what kind of impact do you think these attacks will have on the upcoming October referendum for Catalan independence? Of course, we've seen so many back and forths between the Catalan regional government and the Spanish officials.
That's certainly true. Carles Puigdemont, the head of the Catalan government, has insisted that this referendum will go ahead, that these attacks will not have an impact on what he describes as the democratic process in Catalonia. He says the last thing that should happen is that terrorists should influence what is going on here in Catalonia. There are other people who say that it might not be the time to have such a referendum because the idea of starting political campaigning might be distasteful. But at the moment, two sides are really bitterly divided on that.
Bitterly divided in the aftermath of an attack on Spain last week. Now, that was Sarah Morris reporting for us from Barcelona.